who is America's best known banker? And everyone's going to say Jamie Dimon. But the richest banker is a guy I had never heard of before I read your piece, named Andrew Beal.
We should all set up our own banks. No, that's not possible because you can't really invest in whatever you want to invest in, and so it's too restrictive. And at some point I thought, well, didn't Beal kind of do something like that? And he buys billions and billions of distressed assets while everybody else is, orchestrating this fire sale.
Whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect.
Don't style drift, stick to what you know. But the reality is the world always changes and you have to adapt and evolve with that and have the mental agility. I think it's easy to find someone who's really good for a cycle.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to find someone who's good for several cycles.
If the pigeon was pirouetting in a particular way and the food comes, the pigeon spends the rest of its time pirouetting.
People who are very good at that game, they're almost to me a little bit like alchemists, right?
I think it's Taylor who says that if there's two people you're trying to pick between and they have equal credentials, pick the guy who doesn't look the part. Well, everyone. Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another impromptu Infinite Loops with my good friend, Frederik Gieschen. And we were just talking about his incredible blog that I have been a subscriber to for a long time. And he's thinking of maybe changing the name. So let him hear on Twitter or any other social media or Substack or anywhere you can find Frederik which one you like better. I'm gonna give away the two that he's considering. It might not be either, but it could be both. It could be a subheading. It could be the title. Could be The Alchemy of Money, which I like very, very much. As I joked to Frederik before we started recording, I've been calling myself a symbol manipulator since way back in the way back machine. But then the other one's very intriguing, The Maze. And what's in the news a lot now are all the funny memes being made about a certain someone saying that he was in the arena. And when Frederik told me The Maze, I immediately thought, that's a better description to my way of thinking of what the arena really is, right? So the arena, of course, the famous quote from Teddy Roosevelt, why cheer from the sidelines when you can play in the game is the way I look at it. I prefer to play in the game. Frederik prefers to play in the game. But the game maybe is not just the arena where everything's known and set up, right, Frederik? Sometimes when we enter what we think is the arena, we're actually going into a labyrinth or a maze or something like that. And we're going to talk about that too. But I want to... Go ahead.
You don't want to jump right into that now that you've set it all up? I'm like, Jim, you're doing such a good job of pitching that. And the arena one, I'm so surprised. This was kind of a Cambrian explosion of memes. This was a very good few days on Twitter.
It was fabulous.
So, and of course, everyone who's talking about the arena themselves is just sitting at the desk, and the arena is our, spreadsheets and Bloomberg and and Twitter. So it's all pretty hilarious.
I thought those were the funniest of the memes, right? And were the guys or women who came up with the meme. They show the gladiator with the guy, with chopping somebody's head off. That's the real arena. And then what they call the arena, it's like some word cell or think boy behind a laptop.
It's your podcasting setup. It's quite the arena. Well, to me, The Maze, I like the arena. It's interesting as kind of a framework for, your outer, you're taking risk, you're going out there. But for me, the inner journey, I was thinking of the Labyrinth and sort of you go into your own underworld and there's things that you're avoiding, right? There's a monster, there's a minotaur, and that's standing in the way of you and the center, whatever it is, whether you're looking for treasure, whether you're looking to change as a person, whatever it is, there are things that you're afraid of and that are keeping you from basically growing and going through that transformation and then coming out on the other end. And as I explored that metaphor, the Greek myth is, I was like, oh, this is already fully formed. But life is not quite like that, right? Because in a labyrinth, you have one path to the center, and all you have to do is keep going. You kind of know you'll get there, right? It's this spiral type setup, and all you have to do is be courageous enough and go through the darkness and maybe fight a monster or two, and you'll get there. But life is a little bit more like a maze. I feel like there's multiple points of exit. You can get lost. There's all these dead ends, and you see that all around you. Like, people make bad choices, and ultimately you can arrive at pretty bad outcomes, right? You can lose all the things you hold dear in life, right? Your health, your loved ones, your money, your freedom. There's a lot of outcomes that feel a lot more like, okay, I got to make sure I get this right, and I need certain things. I need to prepare myself when I do that. Like, one of the ideas in the Labyrinth myth is that you need a thread connecting you to the outside world to find your way back. And I thought that was really interesting as a metaphor of its own. You're going on this journey by yourself, kind of in your own maze, but you have a thread connecting you to people you can trust, and there's this bond, and there's people who make sure that thread doesn't get untied from the beginning. So even though it's your own journey, ultimately you want to make sure you're not totally alone, right? You have a bond to a community who understands what you're going through. And so to me, there's all of these different layers to this metaphor. And I'm thinking I use it all the time now for anything that relates to an inner journey, where someone is like, I want this thing, I want to change in this way. And they're not completely looking at what is keeping me from that, and what is this. It's like the hero's journey, but it feels a lot more real to me, because you kind of have to pick up a sword and go down there, and you don't really know in the beginning where you have to go. It's a maze, right? And you have to, I don't know. It's like that to me feels exciting and a little bit scary, and I think that's what a lot of life is. You have to face the fear to get to the part that really excites you.
Yeah, Robert Anton Wilson calls it chapel perilous. And there's all sorts of, and of course, Campbell, Hero's Journey, he one of his better known quotes is, "The treasure you seek is in the cave you fear to enter." And like all of these metaphors, right? They all, if you like really unravel them, they all come back to some sort of fear-based thing that's blocking you.
Yeah.
And I find that like fascinating. And I can't remember whose quote it was, but it was about all of like the Aesop fairy tales, right?
Mm-hmm.
These old stories, right, that survived. They just survived over thousands of years, and that makes them very interesting, right, from a anti-fragile point of view.
Yes.
That they just keep surviving. And the other thing that happens is they get compressed, and so that you're getting like almost, for the good ones, you're getting pure information, right?
Yeah.
And I think the quote was something along the lines of, it isn't so much that these fables teach us that there are dragons that we should fear. Rather, these fables teach us that we can conquer and beat those dragons.
Mm-hmm.
I always
and
thought
it's worth
that was,
doing so. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I always thought that was a great twist.
Yeah, I actually, I mean, I don't know that this is new, but it was new to me, right? So that this idea of the Lindy wisdom and like mythology is an obvious one, but there's others where maybe this is something for, infinite, the infinite umbrella, but really going back and figuring out what has survived and endured across cultures, right? And like myths is one, but there's other, like, certain types of music or movement, or like there's components of culture that seem to be pretty uniform and that survive. And maybe some of that we've discarded over the last 100+ years, and you kind of lost some of that wisdom, and it's worth discovering and rediscovering that and figuring out why did that survive for thousands of years? Like I finally read James Nestor's Breath, which I initially rejected because I was like, this book is hyped and I'm a contrarian, and so I don't need it. Complete ridiculous reaction to it. But I've done a lot of breath work this year, and some of it was very, very potent. And so I finally read the book. I was like, oh, much of this has been around for thousands of years, and kind of science is rediscovering it and stripping it from the stripping it off the spiritual component. But it's techniques that kind of are as ancient as many of our cultures. Or so I don't know. I feel like we're quick to dismiss some of that, and maybe it's a little bit out there. Maybe it's a little bit woo woo, and people are like, okay, I don't really, the people who do it wear funny clothing. I'm like, wait, first we should investigate, right, and figure out, is this possibly be good, and come at it with that kind of beginner's mind.
I love it. We are simpatico in our thinking, because things like Noah's Ark, right? Very simple, and yet, as you know, I love AI, and you can use it to investigate all sorts of things. And so one of the things that I was investigating was like the commonality of myths, and I didn't know that the myth of a great flood is pretty much universal, and it's in every culture, in some form or another. And I was very interested about that, right? Like, if you grow up in a certain set of circumstances, it's like, what did McLuhan say about first you create your tools, then they create you? And so, first you create your myths, and then they create you, and you kind of think your myth is the right myth, right? Because you haven't thought about it too much. And then you realize, wait a minute, all these cultures that, like, I know nothing about, I've never even heard of some of the cultures, where I was learning about the fact that the universality of the myth of a great flood. And then it gets interesting, because then maybe you're looking at something that is an archetype that is a universal archetype, not just specific to like weird cultures using the book title as the definition of Western rich, countries.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I think, yeah, go.
I thought you were going to sell me portfolio insurance with the under the arc metaphor, but the great fun. I was like, wait, what is coming? Is this a pitch to survive the next bubble?
What's wonderful,
to every asset.
As you know, like as we were saying before we started recording, I am incredibly grateful and lucky to be in the place where basically my pitching days are over. Like, you can either listen to me, you can tell me I'm fucking insane. I don't really care. And so the degrees of freedom that allows is really nice. And what I'm trying to do, as I said to you, and why I'm talking to you right now, my friend, is that I want win-win adventures with people that I like. And so when you use that as your sorting mechanism, it makes life a lot more fun, at least.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it always reminds me of Buffett said this thing of, you can't do a good deal with a bad person. And then he also selects for, obviously, people he likes. And this is just a mentally filed away draft. But I think the one time he definitely skirted that rule is when he got involved with Solomon. And of course, the whole thing not just blew up, but I think good Freund, like there's moment where, as it was blowing up, they were hiding things from him. Then they were setting him up to, like, you have to fix this. And I think the guy wanted a golden parachute, and there was this dinner, and Munger was blowing up over the dinner because it was like, this thing is a huge mess, and you're here trying to, extract the last, a golden parachute from the burning ship. Where it was just, to me, that was like one of those obvious moments where you have a good rule, but then you, in your own career, you progress and you acquire this gravitas, and you acquire, a different set of social circumstances, and maybe come close to, it's easy to have a rule and then also get tempted to, maybe in this little instance, because I want to put some money to work, or maybe this person. Yeah, I think it's a really good rule, and I think, especially in Wall Street, but also generally in life, you'll always get tempted to make an exemption. And it's good to always remind yourself of those kinds of first principles.
Totally. And what a great way to lead into what I want to talk to you about today, because this really is an impromptu. I texted you just an hour and a half ago,
Yes,
And
yes.
and I was prompted to text you because I read your excellent article. That's what I want to talk about today. And you have a great line in there, so I chose it to introduce the topic. And your great line is, who is America's best known banker? And everyone's going to say Jamie Dimon. At least everyone I know is going to say, maybe they might name someone in the Fed, but we're talking about
Yeah,
commercial
yeah,
bankers.
yeah.
And then you say, but the richest banker is a guy I had never heard of before I read your piece, named Andrew Beal, America's richest banker. And as I read your piece, I just saw like this is almost a master class about like if you're trying to maximize your objective function for making money, this guy has a pretty good formula. So
Yeah.
I thought it would be great if you could just kind of set the story up for us. And then we'll have a conversation around like how he did this, what's really smart about what he did, maybe what we could suggest as an improvement. I just
No,
thought
that
that
we should all set up our own banks. And yeah, you just texted me was just enough time to put up on a shirt and set up the camera. I was like, wait, Jim, are you sure? You sure you want to do this right now? So I'd first heard about Beal. There's a book called The Professor, the Bank of the Professor and the Suicide King, which is about a poker game. So Beal, the self-made banker, shows up in Vegas and challenges all of the America's top poker players. And I'd read that, and that was kind of interesting. And then there was no biography on him, and he kind of went away again. And then I did a couple of pieces on Buffett, thinking about the alternate history of what if at key junctures Buffett had made a different decision or something had turned out differently, how could his life have played out? And one of them was, well, he went big in insurance. What if he had become a banker instead, right? He owned a little bank. One of his first acquisitions was one. He had to divest it. Like, could he have made a fortune in banking, which is another kind of average industry, but every once in a while somebody figures out a way to still make a fortune there. And my first thought was like, no, that's not possible because you can't really invest in whatever you want to invest in, and so it's too restrictive. And at some point I thought, well, didn't Beal kind of do something like that? And so I started digging into him, and it's pretty fascinating because his story does not at all start out like somebody who'd make 10 billion later. Like, he grew up in Michigan. He had a bunch of these odd jobs, started putting that money into fix and flip real estate deals. And then in the 70s and 80s, he has a few things in real estate that start to pay off. Like, he buys these distressed properties from the government, and just has a few home run investments where he basically fixes up the property, sells it to someone at a cap rate. And then in the 80s, right, there's the savings and loan crisis, and he ended up in Texas because of one of the properties that he bought. Texas was going through a real estate and energy downturn. And so he's like, oh, all the banks around me are failing, and I have this windfall from one of the deals that I did. What am I going to do? I'm going to start a bank, right? I'm going to take advantage of all of this. And he was already, he was, a scrappy guy, or like he was running all of these small businesses, focused on real estate, and always looking at kind of how can I buy something of value and turn it around. And he started just apply that same thing in real estate, in banking, except with access to leverage, right? So similar to Buffett. And so you could see the first few years in the savings and loan crisis, he just bought all of these things from the government at deep discounts. The government is like, okay, I just want this stuff off my hands. He buys it. And when the opportunity set dries up, he's like, okay, there's nothing to do, I guess. I'm not going to do anything. So he waits. 2000 comes around, there's a recession, there's 9/11, so he buys aircraft bonds, and he just always finds a way to keep this thing going and look for the next opportunity in something where there's a distressed seller or somebody just, is scared of the sector. And the big turn, I think, comes in the mid-2000s, right? When the housing boom is underway and all the bankers are out there just getting rich and playing while the music is going. And, what does he do? He goes to Vegas to play poker. He rarely shows up at the office. His bank, he's trying to rent out space in his office because he's let out, I think, a few hundred people he's let go of because the bank is basically shrinking, right? And he's like, I've got nothing to do. All the loans are crazy. And there's a great quote from the person who did loan acquisitions for him. And they even refused to buy regular home loans, backed by Fannie and Freddie. And the guy's like, everybody's laughing at me because we're not doing these deals. And they're like, this is guaranteed by the government. And Beal is like, look, these guarantees are worthless. Like, he saw what was coming. The only thing that he didn't realize was it was going to take, 4 years to play out. So he's sitting there and waiting. And, lo and behold, the financial crisis comes around and he buys billions and billions of distressed assets while everybody else is, orchestrating this fire sale because they're failing. And then the same thing repeats, over the past 10 years because, markets recover, interest rates go down, and there's again nothing to do. So to me, it was kind of this original value investor formula of look for downside protection, look for a really cheap asset, try to do it with, leverage or other people's money, do it smartly, whether that's insurance float or in a fund structure, or in his case, he does use deposits, but he only uses them basically when he sees a fat pitch, right? And so do it smartly. Don't blow yourself up with leverage. Use it only when there's a really asymmetric opportunity available. And so you can see, and somebody on Twitter, Iceman, thank you so much for that, helped me pull all the FDIC data, and you can kind of see in the assets for he has now several banks. It's kind of like this wave that goes up and down as there's a boom and a bust, and he scales it up and down like a hedge fund portfolio, basically, where you go up and down in exposure to the market. So to me, that was...
So the thing that really made me fascinated was, first off, very unusual background for a banker, right? And I think it's Taleb who says that if there's two people you're trying to pick between, and they have equal credentials, pick the guy who doesn't look the part.
Taleb, the surgeon,
because he probably had to work twice as hard to get there. But you also tell kind of the backstory about he had an uncle who fixed TV sets, that they would buy broken TVs for like $1 to $2, and then they would resell them after his uncle fixed them for between 30 and 40. I mean, talk about those are venture capital returns.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. A lot of his early businesses were kind of finding something, fixing it, finding something off value but underpriced, fixing it, reselling it, and then using basically compounding the earnings by putting the money back into something that's cash flowing, like a house, like a rental, and so kind of already, I guess it was the same idea, the same seed, and ultimately same mindset that just translated from that into And
the other, I was out with my friend Michael Mobison last night for dinner, and I've been kind of fascinated by can we use the big five personality profile to make assumptions and or predictions about what type of investor somebody's going to be, whether they're going to be a good investor, not. Michael agrees that he thinks there's something there, and so we're actually going to maybe work on something together that would test that out. We probably could be wrong, probably are wrong. But the one I'm thinking about is with Beal in particular. It seems to me that one of the characteristics that you have to have, and the reason I'm bringing up the big five, is this agreeableness factor. So on the big five, I score very low on agreeableness, and yet I find myself to be a very agreeable person. that isn't what they mean by that, though.
Yeah.
What they mean by it is people who score very low on agreeableness, and my guess is that Andrew would score near the bottom decile, is that if they think something looks obvious and that things are stupid, they not only do they not do that thing, they go out of their way to say, that's fucking dumb. and why are you doing that? And the thought, like, as you were giving the background on how he got into becoming a banker, is like, you had a quote in the article that made me think of The Big Short. And what he was saying is, and you brought it up in your introductory remarks, like, everybody knew that Fannie and Freddie, that was just like treasuries. Bullshit. No, it wasn't. And so I love the fact that he's like, yeah, no, that's fucking dumb. And go ahead, keep buying them, keep dancing. Music's going to stop here. And then there's the quote that they attribute to Twain probably isn't his, but along the lines of, whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect, right? And so let's segue a little bit into, like, this guy is really an interesting character. I mean, he blew $200 million on an aerospace thing because he just loved the idea. And then he's got a math problem that he actually calls the Beal conjecture, that he offers $100,000 prize on. I really like this guy. I think I maybe want to meet this guy or have him on the podcast. What do you think?
Yeah, I think if you could get him on the podcast, that would be interesting. To me, there's all these other... To me, this comes back to, right, okay, agreeableness, definitely an independent thinker, right? I think in investing, you have to be a little bit careful with just being a pure contrarian, because most of the time the market goes up, over the long term, and so you don't want to be on the short end of something.
Absolutely true.
Just because you don't like the herd. So, but at these key junctures, you have to really think for yourself, and I think that's not just what he did, but also there's all this evidence of him just following his curiosity. Right? He reads an article about how expensive. I think the first article he read was about satellites, and that was interesting, but then it was too expensive to shoot them up into space. And then, his mind starts going like, okay, what if there was a cheaper way to get them into space? Now, it turns out he's not Elon Musk, right? It might take someone with a lot of engineering pedigree to pull that off. And so for Beal, like, he tried it, and I think he lost, or the venture ultimately cost $200 million. And he had this quote where he said, people thought I was crazy, and it was like this midlife crisis. And he's like, well, it was just a calculated risk, right? It's something he really wanted to try. And then he ring-fenced how much money he could afford to invest in it. And when it didn't work, then it didn't work. And so to me, this was all indicative. It might actually be useful, right? To me, it's indicative of this somebody who's like, here's a really interesting problem, and I want to try to fix it. It's not always going to work, right? I have to be willing to place bets that have some chance of working out, but I can't just go for the sure thing. But I'm also really willing to do the work and go wherever my own instincts lead me. And I was thinking, why was he able to not play when everybody else was playing, right? And I think there's a degree that there's character, but there's also the conditions that we create for ourselves, right? And if you run a fund, or if you run a publicly traded bank and you're a CEO, you can't. Maybe you can, but most of them, you can't really shrink the bank for 4 years and do nothing and fire all kinds of people, right? Your board's going to fire you. Your shareholders are going to hate. Like, it doesn't work. And so it struck me, because there was a moment where one of his board members was like, are we a dinosaur? Like, we're shrinking, we're not doing anything. The regulators are kind of asking us why are we raising money? Because that's another thing he did. He sold preferred stock. So he didn't give up ownership, but he was like, the risk of my own bank is underpriced, so I'm going to raise money even though I don't need it. Before I actually do need it, right? And so he created all of these conditions, including things for himself to do, right? That he had these other interests that kept him busy. I mean, I'm convinced that, any smart investor or entrepreneur, the mind is always going, right? There's always an itch to do something, to find something that's interesting, to solve some challenge, some puzzle. So if you're sitting in the office all day, on the market, you don't really get it. You don't, there's nothing really to do. It's very hard, I think, to resist the urge to play, unless you're like, okay, I'm going to do these other things right now, solve some math problem, play golf, go learn something new, right? And make sure that temptation doesn't take over. So he did that, and he also created the conditions that allowed him to be patient. Like, he controlled his own destiny by owning all of the bank. He had enough capital, he had things to do, and he cut staff, right? Like, he kept the cost basis low, and that obviously... that's tough, right? I think employees, it's obvious that was to his benefit, and other people were worse off for that. But I think you could make the case that someone like him running a public bank, or running maybe a hedge fund, right, like a credit hedge fund or something like that, and being under the gun for performance every quarter, every year, would have eventually made different decisions. I think it's really easy to imagine ourselves like, oh, I could have seen that, I could have figured that out, and then I would have done that. Well, would I if every month, every year, people are prodding me and like, why aren't you doing this? And you're like, you're an idiot for not picking up that nickel in front of the steamroller, right? It's really hard to actually pull this off. And for years, just sit and watch and have the confidence that you're ultimately going to be proven right. That's the other thing, right? He said like he thought this was going to be over 6 months, from when he started to think he was crazy. And then it took 4 years or something, from 2004 to 2008. That's a long time. I'm on Twitter, like a week feels a long time. There's a new meme cycle coming. 4 years is a long time to not make money when that's really what you're focused on.
Yeah, and the insights that you drew there, I think, are worth like really pounding on, because first off, the agent principal problem, right? So if you, for example, I'm lucky enough to, on our venture side, we don't have LPs. So if we get conviction, and even if other people think it's crazy, we'll do it. And that frees you in a way where, if I'm being honest, if I was running a publicly owned vehicle, or if I had LPs, I wouldn't make decisions the same way. I've actually felt that. So, for me, I can totally get that. But the other thing that I think about when I was reading your piece was a throwback to the way investment banks used to be organized. Investment banks, not only did they have the names of the partners as the name of the institution, right? JP Morgan was Mr. JP Morgan, right? And they were partnerships. Why was that important? Because they had their skin in the game. There was no grifting. Yeah, sure. We'll grift if it's not our money, but if it's actually our name and our money on the line, that leads you to very different thought processes, very different times where you're willing to pull the trigger, very different times when, if you are really that much, I have another friend who calls it soul in the game. If your name is on the door and it's all your money, you are going to make very, very different decisions than if you have to be a public, like you say. If you're a public institution, or if you're running a credit fund and you're like, yeah, we're not going to do anything for 4 years, you're going to be out of business, because all of your LPs are going to fire you, or your board's going to fire you. And to me, it's such a great learning lesson that we've optimized for exactly the wrong things. And why does it surprise us that you and I think, had a conversation about one of the things that bothered me most about the great financial crisis was nobody went to jail, right? And during when he made his first fortune during the S&L crisis, lots of people went to jail.
Yeah.
So even it might not have been their money, it might not have been their skin or name on the door, but there were consequences, right? And you fucked up, guess what? You're going to go to jail for 10 years. And then we had the great financial crisis. We socialized all the losses, and we let the private people retain the gains. Well, if that is what you're going to be optimizing a system for, guess what you're going to get a lot more of? You're going to get a ton more grifters and those types of people.
It's called being in the arena, Jim. Listen, this is. I mean, I hear you. That definitely seems to have changed, and yeah, you get what you incentivize for, right?
You really do. You really do. And so, maybe one of the lessons that you enumerate in your wonderful piece is one of the things he sets up is, we're not bankers. We're think about this like we're running a hedge fund.
Yeah.
Talk about that, because I think that's a really brilliant way to reframe.
Yeah. So I came about this in one article where he set up a vehicle which was basically a firm originating loans, but he called it, it had hedge fund in the title, and it seems like he played with the idea of running a hedge fund. And then he tells his people, like, okay, think as if you were working at a hedge fund, like think like investors. Basically, don't think like bankers and like just, originate loans and put them on the balance sheet and we're going to get paid like a spread. No, think like an investor, think like a risk taker. And then in the next step, he decided against starting a hedge fund. He's like, wait a second, I could do that, but first of all, I'd have to deal with investors, and I'm already dealing with regulators, and like that's not pleasant. But investors, no way. And then I have to split the profits, and I was like, this is how you have a really good business on your hand. If a 2 and 20 fee structure is not enough to entice you to take outside money, right? And you never had to raise outside capital either, which is kind of incredible, right? Like in that way, it's also similar to Berkshire, right? Like it's just this compounding machine. And like every time he found attractive opportunities, sometimes he'd taken a partner, but by and large, he managed to do it all without giving up ownership or control. And the other interesting thing that he did with his employees, right? On the one hand, he told them to think like investors, but then he took something from his poker time into his own investment process. So in Vegas, he showed up and he was really concerned that he was giving away information like tells to all these pros. And so he'd buy different kinds of sunglasses. He'd put up earphones and listen to music. And this is crazy, but he put a little motor or something into his sock that would tip him every few seconds. And then before making a decision, he would always wait until the next time that he get that impulse. So to kind of randomize the time that it took him to make a decision, or not that it took him to make a decision, but to act on it. And when he made investment decisions, basically he had has this conference room, and it was like, okay, he has his staff come in and he's like, pitch me on this portfolio. Tell me, give me the report. Tell me what's going on here. And then he asks some questions. And then he comes up with what he wants to pay for it. And while he does that, he's shielding basically himself, right? Like he's shielding his work, his monitor. And he's like, I don't want to give away to my own employees indications of, that would show them what it is that I want to hear. I want them to almost in isolation. And it's kind of a weird process, right? But he's like, I want to keep this process pure. I want to get the information from them and I want to make my own decision. And I don't want to get into this dynamic where, the analyst or the originator is kind of trying to game the system because they're like, I know what the boss wants to hear, like there's all of these ways that as you get to know a person, you kind of know their buttons and their preferences. And so I thought it was really interesting that he was trying to keep the purity and keep the bias out of the process, even if it made him look, a little bit strange, right? Like I just like at a poker table, instead of socializing, he's putting up everything to isolate himself and in your own company rather than having this cordial meeting, like, okay, let's all dissect this thing and have fun. He kept it pretty rigid. And so I respect that. I'm not sure I'd enjoy it, in a working environment. It felt a little bit like intense, but I did think it was real interesting because he was like, my edge is that I can make a really rational decision about this particular asset, right? Like I understand the valuation. I want to understand what I want to pay for it. And as soon as I get influenced by other people, that's going to go away.
I love that section for a couple of reasons. First off, if you do things in the same way, always the same kind of thought process, the same kind of unfolding of an evaluative process, people know, right? And so what I liked about that process, even though, very odd, but he understood that by doing it that way, he was not conditioning his employees to pitch just one way. And so, like, habits make our neural nets deeper, right? We have deeper grooves in our neural networks if it's a habit, and they're really hard to break out of, right? And so when you do it the way, when I was reading that part of it, I'm like, what's brilliant about this is he doesn't allow the people who work for him to habituate a pitch, right? And because they don't even know. And then the thing that underlines that, and that's why I thought the piece was so well done, is this idea of the random buzz generator in his sock. Even if he's made the decision, he won't announce it until that random buzz goes off. So people, we are so conditioned to linear thought. Cause, effect, linear. This is what happened here. I'm going to project that into the future in a linear fashion. That is the way the world works. And if you can condition yourself to be a nonlinear thinker and a nonlinear decision maker, that's going to be really valuable. And what he was taking advantage of, I think, with his random buzz generator, is the fact that most of the people he was betting, I guess, that most of the people around the table he was playing poker against were kind of linear, and they were looking for that pattern, right? And so whenever he, does this, he's bluffing, and I'm making it. I'm touching my face here for people who are just listening to us. But when there's no discernital pattern, that's very upsetting to the average mind. And I recalled, as I was reading your piece, this thing where they did it with pigeons, and they randomly released food, right? So there was no rhyme or reason to what the pigeon was doing when the food was released, but the pigeon inferred a reason. So if the pigeon was pirouetting in a particular way and the food comes, the pigeon spends the rest of its time pirouetting in that fashion, even though no food, right? And so I thought that was also kind of a brilliant way that he arranged this. But he also, another thing that he was really big on was go all in when the conditions are like what you perceive as perfect. And he would, I think, I'm probably wrong, but he would probably put that in terms of, hey, if the odds are incredibly in your favor, right, as you're calculating them, there's always, you could be wrong. But if your base rate for calculating odds is pretty good, right? If the movie, not the snapshot, right? Like if I made a decision, one decision today, and then decided every decision I'm making in the future was because I made that one right, I'm an idiot, because who knows why that worked, right?
Yes.
That's why you don't want a snapshot of a decision. You want a movie, which is a base rate. And that's why base rates are so valuable. But then also kind of this ability to have the guts to go all in. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, I could tell you were out with Michael last night with the base rates are coming up.
Hey, read the first edition, my friend, of What Works on Wall Street. And I was all about base rates.
I think you're completely on point, though, because this whole thing does not work, right? If all of this waiting, all of this does not pay off, if when the opportunity comes around, you're not swinging for the fences. And I think even with him, it was tricky because yes, he did that. And from what I understand, in the 90s, he put as much money as he had to work. And then, in the financial crisis, though, he bought billions of dollars of assets, but he also, from what I understand, he expected it to be worse, right? It's almost like if you're anticipating a bad event for a while and you're waiting, well, you don't know where the bottom is. It's really hard to go all in at that moment because there could always be another dip, and you just don't know, and you're kind of conditioned yourself to be cautious and skeptical now. And especially since this last time, right, government intervention has become a lot more important. Now, if you politically don't like that, you might already be conditioned to, kind of throw your hand up at the wall, like, this is not how it's supposed to work. I'm supposed to get more bargains. And so even he later commented, and, he did well in the financial crisis, but he wished he'd, done twice as much. And understandably, though, in that moment, he didn't know where the bottom was. But he did have the courage to bet on his conviction, and I think that's it's tough because conviction is such a tricky thing, right? Especially if you have him, like at that point, he'd been investing for decades. So I think he'd have a good grasp on what kind of collateral he'd underwrite and, these different markets. Like he'd really understand, this is, I think, something people misunderstand with Buffett, who's kind of an unhealthy obsession of mine, because I think he's so interesting, yet perpetually misunderstood and like reduced to these sound bites. And there's this thing where he can make a decision very quickly, right? There's the famous, I did a thing on Schroeder's lessons, the author of The Snowball, and she gave a few interviews and talked about what she learned from him. And there's this thing that he can make a decision in 5 minutes or less on the phone. And that's because he has well-developed filters, but it's also because a lot of things he's been tracking for decades, and he understands certain industries really well. And so you can't have that same conviction or go through that same process if you don't have that same knowledge base or if you don't understand the base rate. So I do think, one has to keep in mind, like he went all in during the financial crisis after running this bank for, 2 decades and having been a real estate investor for another almost basically 2 decades before that, right? Like he started early in his teenage years to buy his first houses. So he really understands certain real estate and certain markets, I think probably just very, very, very well. And so, it's always tricky with these stories. What lessons can you really take from them? Because to me, these people, you included, but people who are very good at that game, they're almost to me a little bit like alchemists, right? Like there's the science, there's the analysis, there's the behavioral aspect, and then there's a little bit of a mysterious element to me. That's always like, this person, there's something different in the way they perceive the world and the way they understand themselves in relationship to the market and the opportunity set. There's something going on that's, I can try and understand this. That does not mean I could just as easily or somebody else could just as easily do it. Like there's a quality to it that's a little bit, don't try this at home necessarily without having the same knowledge. It's not trivial. It's easy to reduce this to a headline. It was like, oh, he went all in. And it's easy to just misapply that all over the place to situations that are nothing like what he faced. Because again, he waited years and years for the perfect opportunity in an asset class he understood very well, and he prepared himself for it. And again, that to me was like the parallel with Buffett in a lot of ways. And Buffett, I guess, shows that it's not trivial. Even if you've done it well throughout your career, you might not always go all in when it's appropriate, right? There's, that one is like, I can respect it or admire it without at all pretending like I could just copy that.
Yeah, I think that, how I feel about the people, the morning routine clickbait and all that bullshit. Like, here are the 5 things all millionaires do in the morning. No, I'm sorry, that's wrong. And who gives a shit as to whether, they start with a cold plunge and then meditate or bang their gong and do all of that. We are completely missing the point.
They put on 5 pieces of clothing. That's what they do.
And so what fascinates though, and why I love your work, is as you continue to find people like this, or insights on Buffett, or insights on other great investors, great alchemists, because I totally agree with you. I joked before we started recording that, hey man, I've been calling myself a symbol manipulator for a long time. And that's kind of like what really alchemy is, right? And like Newton, that he spent what? If you looked at hours spent during Newton's life, like maybe an hour of his 24-hour clock of life was spent on physics, and 23 was spent on alchemy.
Yeah. And then speculating in the South Sea bubble a little bit. Like that's where like Newton is actually, it all kind of came together. I'm like, yeah, this person, you can be a serious scientist. You can also really be interested in, converting lead to gold or whatever, finding some other really interesting, but, out there idea and trying to figure that out, which to me is like the people who go into the market. Like you have to have a little bit of that arrogance of like, here's nature, here's the market, here's this complex system, and I'm the one who's I'm gonna figure out this way to get out of it what I want, right? So that, Newton is a great example.
And I may, I whenever Ramp Capital would put up the picture of the very attractive girl, and then the line on the meme is something along the lines of "Tell me something I don't know" or whatever. And the one I used to always tease Ramp with was the stock market is a complex adaptive system that works and the market clears because it is driven by heterogeneous opinions, right? So I'm selling Apple, you're buying Apple. Both of us are right. We have different reasons. I'm selling it for a different reason than you're buying it. And that's why markets clear. That's why markets are often efficient, because we have a heterogeneity of opinions driving the clearing price. But when markets trend into either bubble or crash territory, opinions move into homogeneity. Everyone's thinking the same thing at the same time, which causes what I call information cascades. And these information cascades reinforce the homogeneity of the opinions, where you get people saying, well, everyone knows, right? Everyone knows that A, B, and then C always follows, right? And the information cascade basically breaks all but the sturdiest thinker, right? It happened to me, right? Like I wrote a piece called "The Internet Contrarian" in April of 1999, in which I said 85% of these companies are going to be carried out of the market feet first. This is the biggest bubble we've ever seen in our lives. But the information cascades around the internet were so profound, so pervasive, that what does this idiot do? In September, he founds an internet-based investment advisor.
Of course, it's the future. Have you not heard, Jim? I love that.
But see, that's the thing. We always tend to overrate our own smarts, our own ability to withstand the storm. And the people I really admire are like this guy, in terms of business, right? I don't know what he's like. I'll have to read that book in which you found him. I have it somewhere. But anyway,
you might not agree with his politics, but
But I
think we have to, be able to see people for what they are,
right,
which is multiple aspects, and you don't have to agree with all of them.
Exactly. And I've never used the litmus test style of thinking, right? Like I can get a great idea from somebody whose politics I think are idiotic or ridiculous, right? And vice versa. So, but I like that, the idea that, you put it well, the headline, right? So the headline on Buffett is not Buffett at all, right? In fact, you and I at when we were having a chat, when we were together for lunch, and I said something along the lines of, hey, I admire Buffett, but for completely different reasons than the people who go to the Woodstock for Capitalism every year in Omaha. I admire him because he's an ice cold, stone gangster killer. And like people, it's like me, if this were a religious thing, St. Warren, me saying this, I'd be burned at the stake as a heretic. What?
It is a religious thing, right? I mean, that's it not with the stake burning, but it's definitely, I mean, Schrader commented on this where she said she was trying to, I think she was digging into is like, is Buffett ruthless, and like, what does he do? And she basically said like people were going out of their way to be like, no, he's very honest, he's like above board and everything. Like they were just emphasizing the point to such an extent, and she was like, well, he must have done something to, and not that he was totally unethical, but some of his early deals, right? Like in order to buy something that's undervalued, you have to get it from somebody who will sell it to you, right? And like if that person doesn't know what this asset is worth and it's illiquid, and you might have to drive through town and like knock on their door and convince them to sell it to you, right? Like there's things you might have to do to get rich that will leave someone else obviously worse off. In the market, it's more anonymous, right? And you can kind of gloss over that. Yeah, with him, it's interesting because he's such a strong cult of personality that he's also cultivated, right? And I understand why. I think it's still valid. Like I came around full circle. I was like a big Buffett fan early on, and then at some point, I went to the meeting in '09. I was like, I don't want to have anything to.
40,000 contrarians.
Yeah, 40,000 contrarians, and he was walking on water, and it just felt like I was too late to that particular party, and there was nothing, everything had already been said. And then over the last couple of years, I've kind of come back around. It's like, oh, there's a reason why he's so popular, and like, there's actually, it's kind of rare to find someone who does well in business and has legitimate wisdom to dispense. I think most often we find that somebody gets rich and then they offer their opinion on other things, and it's like, well, yeah, maybe I don't know. I don't know about that. But then, also, once you're rich, people, I think what happens is people will not tell you if you're off base on something. I mean, I've worked at family offices, and I think, a legitimate bubble starts working when everybody around you kind of depends on you for their well-being, right? They will absolutely yes man you to death because it's their job. And so I think it actually gets really difficult to learn and improve in that situation because you're in your own. It's like a social media echo bubble, right? You think you're right on everything because there's no incentive or no ability for people around you to really say no. So yeah, sorry, I'm going off track, but
No. Actually, that's quite a good track to think about because you're absolutely right. The higher you rise in a hierarchy, the less good the information you get.
yeah,
And like McNamara during the Vietnam War is a classic example of that. He was a quant, but a quant is only as good as the data and numbers they're getting. And so his underlings were feeding him bad data. And they were feeding him bad data because they were terrified of losing their position.
yeah,
And so they again, we're back to incentives, right? And if your incentive and you work for some big shot and your incentive is to keep that position and your choice is be brutally honest and tell the secretary, well, actually, Secretary McNamara, we're getting our asses kicked. And then him say, no, we're not, and you're fired or you're disloyal to me. So what happens, it's like Gresham's law, right? The banking law, bad money drives out good. Bad people drive out good people. Because if if we're staying on that theme for a minute, and you got two analysts who are your deputies at the Department of Defense, and you're McNamara, and you don't have that insight that, whoa, maybe I should hire that guy who is irascible and tells the truth and everything. And if your own behavior is to fire the guy who tells you the truth and promote and or retain the guy who's lying to you, bad people drive out good.
yeah.
And
That's very hard though, right? I thought about that. I mean, going back to Buffett again, but I was like, where did Buffett get his ideas from? And turns out a lot of it came from the Pritzkers, like the Chicago-based family that kind of grew from law firm into basically building a mini Berkshire without the insurance, which was called Mormon. And they intersected with him with Buffett in a deal, and he started learning from them and met Jay and figured out what they were doing. And similar to Berkshire, right? Like a big part of it was a conglomerate. Each business unit was run by its own kind of almost like an owner operator type person, and just picking the right people or making sure they stay in place after you buy the business was almost a key part of the edge, right? And Buffett emphasizes this all the time, right? It's like if I buy the business, then I have to put a professional manager in place because the old guy is leaving. Like it changes the whole dynamic. And I want people who run this as if it was their own business, who will tell me honestly what's going on, who are not, afraid I'm going to just chop off their head immediately when something goes wrong. And I think it's that to create that kind of culture and that kind of structure and to sustain it, that's tricky. And I think Buffett and Munger joked about that they'd rather err on kicking out someone later, and kind of letting a few things pass before they act, and that was an inherent trade-off that they had to make. I'm going to have to dig up this trade and quote and share it on Twitter, because there was somebody who was going senile, and they basically waited too long to switch out the CEO of the business unit. And Munger was like, well, this is part of the cost of doing business for us, because we have to operate with a lot of trust. We can only attract good people in their businesses if we give them this trust. And the trade-off is that every once in a while, we're getting hurt by it a little bit. But it's very hard to do that.
Yeah, I mean, right there, like you're so good at this, like almost the book you might want to write. By the way, we're going to have a publishing vertical. So
perfect. That's where the money is. That's where the money is in book publishing.
If you go to a different publisher, I will be personally upset.
You'll sue me.
No, I won't sue you. What did Vanderbilt say when they screwed him? Gentlemen, you have undertaken to ruin me. I shall not sue you, for the law is too slow. I will ruin you.
I will bury you. I will meme you every single day.
Exactly. He went all Roman and Carthage on their ass. Nice. No, but I think that might be a great book, because it's not. I think what is unfolding here is there's all of these really interesting stories, right? Especially like about this banker, and then about Buffett and everything else. And they're all different, but they all teach something. And that'd be a great book, not what to think or what to do, but how to think about it, how to operate. And then give the example that you just gave, which is a great one. Yeah, you know what? If trust and good people are going to be what you're optimizing for, of course there's going to be the time when somebody's senile and you missed it. Yeah. And that's kind of like the error factor. And I always used to give that as one of the hallmark good parts of being a quant, right? Like a traditional stock picker, a traditional fundamental stock picker. Every stock that they buy, they have to, out of necessity, believe that it's going to go up if they're buying, right? And so in their mind, the way their mind is framing it is, I have to be 100% right 100% of the time, right? Whereas a quant, we have accepted error factors. We know through doing the long-term backtests that this particular strategy, at least historically, directionally, failed versus its benchmark 30% of all rolling 5-year periods. And so that gets to a different type of thought, right? So it's subtle and you're almost unaware of it, but one leads to kind of a deterministic type thought, yes or no. The other is a probabilistic way of looking at the world and saying, 30% of the time I'm going to be wrong.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's interesting because there's a significant amount of overlap right between investors and people who play games of chance. And for example, Bill Miller, prominently, he used to study, and he referred to this in his letters, like he studied poker players and other gamblers. And that mindset shift is not easy, right? It's not intuitive. And I've often thought that the first thing that Buffett was good at was basically underwriting odds, first at the racetrack and then later also in insurance. And he'd always comment, we'll do any deal if the mathematical edge is in our favor, not if, we don't have to be sure this deal is going to work out. We just have to have an edge that compensates us for the risk. And so I think for him, intuitively, there is that, he can think of that. You can think like that as an investor, understanding that it's a probabilistic game. But I totally agree with you that for the average person, or maybe for the average investor, this is not intuitive at all, because you're picking the stock. And also, I think increasingly you're being taught, to run with concentration, because otherwise you might just as well go into the index, right? And so you're doing a lot of deep work, because it's harder to stand out as an investor, right? The game is a lot more competitive than 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? It's people go to extreme lengths to dig up data. And all of that comes with bias. Right now, I know a lot more about this, and this better work out. Like it's harder to look at all the work that you invest and then think, well, it might be, a 55 or 60% chance. What's the base rate? And the base rate for great investors still is not like they're going to hit home runs all the time, right? But that's something that's very hard to accept ex ante, because you're like, I did all this work. This thing better work out, and I better get rich with it, and then it's hard to let go too, right? Like once you're just like sunk cost and
there's just
commitment.
there's so many pitfalls, and again, just being aware of them puts you ahead of a lot of people, right? It's just like the one you just mentioned in terms of the idea of you got to be completely open to the idea that X% of the time I'm just going to be wrong. And I do think, though, as I was also listening to your response, is I've always been a strong advocate for finding the process or the methodology that's right for you, right? Because like the way I'm built, I'm always building algorithms in my head. And that's the way I was ever since I was a kid, right? Like when I grew up in Minnesota, and they finally allowed a horse track called Canterbury Downs. And I didn't know anything about horse racing or anything, but like I was young. I'm like, oh, let's go. This is fun. And so I was sitting there and I was watching the board where the odds change, right? And so I just sat, and all I did for the first time I was there was watch that board and make notes. And one of the things that I noticed was that when the odds on a horse changed rather dramatically towards the end, right before all bets were closed, you could do very well. You could only hit like a single, but if you simply put a bet down on the horse where the odds changed most dramatically in that horse's favor in the last, call it 15 minutes of the window, and your bet was to win, place, or show, you did the batting average on that bet was really, really high.
Interesting.
And what you were doing was you were freeloading on the wisdom of the crowd, right?
Yeah.
Because all these other people whose knowledge base is probably certainly was vastly more than mine, right? They're out there, they're looking at the horse, they're looking at the condition of the track. All of this gets aggregated into those changing odds, right? And you're kind of being a lazy freeloader, which again, in my case, it's always lazy, underlies it. But the example is one where that process, that kind of methodology fit me in the way I look at the world. And then others are going to have to do really deep work. They're going to know every widget that comes off that production line. I'm not saying that is a wrong way to do it. I'm saying it might be right for that type of mind. What do you think?
First of all, I agree. And this is so interesting that you mentioned the slight mispricing once the odds start changing in a dramatic way, because I think the same thing happens sometimes with stocks. Like good news comes out and it might still not be fully reflected, because then you're running up against the bias of anchoring. Oh, this was just worth this, and now the market's in. Like it's very hard to then rationally readjust to the new reality, because you've been living in the old reality for a long time, and so I think there's this time period of adjustment where someone like you might be like, well, no, I know, the market tends to, in this specific situation, underprice this and jump in there. And I totally agree with you that sort of the first order of business is to know yourself and understand your own inclinations, also your own emotional makeup, and what it is that, in terms of strategy that would work for you, which is difficult because you step out and like everybody tells you like, this thing worked for me, and this is how you're going to get rich, and this is what you should do. And most often, I think they're trying to either sell you something or feel good about their own process, right? And like kind of, it's tricky. It's also tricky because you have to find that thing, you have to test it, and then you have this like long feedback period, right? It's not always obvious. Like, let's say you start your career and you started in fundamental analysis of equities, and at some point you're like, I don't enjoy this. I want to trade, or I want to do quant or whatever. But like, you've already started in this career track, like the cost goes up over time. At least if you're, this is actually, I think, something that I mean, I have all of these mental drafts. Yeah. But I think there's a huge difference between being an investor and being in the business of investing, right? Like what we just talked about, it's a big difference figuring this out for yourself versus figuring out in a professional seat. And I think this kind of gets misunderstood, and I'm probably part of the problem of conflating this, but the advice that's right for somebody who is in the business of investing can be very different for somebody who is an investor. And I think this has become a big issue maybe last 20, 30 years as this, the business has institutionalized, and a lot of people are in a seat where the job is to create a certain risk return profile for the buyer of a product, right? For some institution that wants a certain risk reward profile or access to a certain strategy, access to a certain asset class. And it used to be different, right? And like you go back, and the person who would run a portfolio is truly an investor, is doing the work themselves. And now it's sort of there's a lot more nuance, and I think that gets lost. And it's the same with this, figuring out what works for you. Well, now it's like, okay, what works for the client, and where's the career trade-off, better or worse, right? Where am I less likely to get replaced by AI or an ETF? So yeah, I think this is part of why I keep harping in my writing on the inner journey. Because I think all of the emphasis goes on the outer, well, quote unquote journey, but how to find an attractive investment, how to construct a portfolio, how to, figure out the markets, all of those things that are directed to the outside, and figuring out the outside world and interpreting that data. And then the reality is half of the game takes place on the inside, right? How do you react in a certain situation? Not just as it relates to biases and decision-making, but also, I've written about this too, very things that are not really talked about, like burning out and just kind of either getting tired of the work or being in a situation where, you're running up against a wall in a bubble or something for years, and it's just grinding you out, and the market is constantly telling you that you're wrong. And I was wondering, like, why, the question of like, why are even great track records, why is it so rare to find them past, 2+ decades? And there's a few obvious reasons. People get started late, or they retire, or they're just too rich to care. Then they blow up. And then I think there's a good chunk of people who just burn out of the game, and who found, even if they found something that worked well for them, they found themselves in a place where it was, they had not developed a process or conditions that allowed them to sustain that stress and that pressure for a long period of time. So I think it is totally about finding what works for you. And then there's a second component, which is figuring out how to play the long game. And so we can make fun of the morning routines. And I think there's all of that sort of productivity porn, and like that's neither here nor there. I think there's sometimes gems in there, but by and large, it's just engagement bait. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of things that are important health-wise that are completely not talked about, because they're kind of like, you wouldn't talk about this with your investors, because then they're like, well, this guy is too weak, quote unquote, to run a portfolio for me. But I think that are really important, and you can see it in, Soros had a time when he burned out and came back, and like Peter Lynch retired early. Like there's all of these instances where people were clearly just hitting their limit, even with something that they were really good at and that worked for them. And so yeah, it's not easy to figure out all these things, but that to me is fascinating. Like, how do you really play for the long term and not burn out. Like in the metaphor of the maze, it's like, how do you find your treasure without getting lost, right? Like I feel like that's often the missing part. Even if you're trying to get wealthy, right? Like it's very easy to succeed at that and then completely fail at a lot of other things in life. So you want to be very careful with how you study people, who you study or who you emulate, and kind of trying to see them in their full picture, because Andy Beal is probably very good at some things, but he might not be good at everything. And so I have to be kind of conscious of that and figure out what are the right lessons to learn here and what are the right lessons for me. And they might be different for the right lessons for Jim or for somebody else.
Yeah, I agree 100% because everyone's unique and everyone's got to find that combination that unlocks their best self, and what they're hoping to achieve or what they want their life to be like. And that's why I think kind of the process that you do and other people I admire who just look at these people and find these really interesting stories and then write it like you wrote this in such a way that, you get people like me I want people to hear about this because like it's really interesting and it's unusual. And as you were saying about the investment, whether you're running an investment firm or whether you're just an investor, they are very different, right? I'm not as cynical as to say that people who start in asset management companies are in it just for the money. I think that for the most part, most of them are in it because they're just so curious about why markets behave the way they behave. But I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that I really hated was when every portfolio was called a product. And like that really rubbed me the wrong way because, I used to say like half of the new offerings and like ETFs or before ETFs and mutual funds were designed by marketers, not by investors. And man, you could tell the difference. The ones that are designed by marketers end up like, for the most part, not all of them, but many of them end up just crashing and burning because they are appealing to very different instincts, right? They're appealing to the mimetic part of a human, and they're appealing to the thing where the halo effect, like, oh, he's rich, so he must be smart about this.
Yeah.
No, not at all. And in fact, sometimes you find exactly the opposite. Well, I, as you know, can talk to you forever. I know you have an engagement and I have another one coming up, but I do want to do the bookend on Beal because he did this great thing or great in terms of financial return thing. And it took a lot of discipline and he had to be willing to be a really odd person, like firing staff like they're just assets as opposed to people. I don't know that I could do that. But then he didn't do anything for a long time. But then what did he do in 2022?
Yeah, and so I'm not. This is coming at it with some distance, right? Like the book is still being written, so to speak. But last year he piled into Treasury. I'm sorry, into TIPS, so into inflation-protected treasuries. And it seems like he did that late in the year when yields were going up, and the real yield on those I think was getting close to 2%. Did it on short duration and did it with brokered deposits. And so like this is kind of the information I have from the outside, and you can see that assets for the bank spiked significantly. To me, this was a little bit of, was kind of out of the ordinary, right? It's not like he'd done like a large levered bond trade before. So it seemed to me like, okay, maybe he got an attractive spread on those assets versus what at the time he had to pay on the brokered deposits. He was protected against inflation getting worse. So it seemed possibly just asymmetric and interesting, but also maybe kind of a bridge. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if, a year or two from now, if there's, with higher rates and kind of a so-so economy, there's a lot more distress in real estate and corporate bonds. I mean, I worked in evaluating levered credit for a while, and I was like, that there was a big boom in all of that. And it wasn't designed to operate at rates that were 5% higher. So it wouldn't surprise me if that was kind of an asymmetric trade that he took for a couple of years before, pivoting into the next big distressed investment. But it's also possible that he was just like, he'd been sitting on his hands for a while, and here was an attractive way to pick up spread with basically no downside, if I understand it right. And that was just, I don't know. This is it gets a little bit into speculation, right? It would be great to talk to him about it and figure out exactly what he's thinking and why he's doing that trade. But it was kind of unusual. It got some headlines at the time because the banks have to file their asset reports with the FDIC. So you can kind of see something's going on. Like he's doing nothing for a long time, did a little bit in the oil patch, did some distressed power plants. So he did a few things, but there wasn't really much for him to do for a while. And then he made this big bet on tips, and basically buying tens of billions of them. Yeah, I don't want to go out too far on a limb because I don't really, I wasn't in the conference room when he was, shielding his decision making process. But it was interesting to see that he found, something to swing at. And for me, I don't know. For me, the most interesting question was like, oh, what is he going to do next, right? Like, is this, what does he think about the next couple of years? And because I think much like Buffett, and also much like, large alternative asset managers, like they get a lot of information from directly from their portfolio companies. So they kind of, I think, can see a little bit around the corner. Not that they always get it right, but I think to me is that's an interesting spot to figure out, okay, where's the next opportunity set gonna pop up? And if it's in a credit cycle, I'm sure he's gonna be very focused on that one and hit it again.
Yeah, very interesting. One of the things that I try to do is model things and then see what are the commonalities, how do they differ? So kind of create a benchmark. And what I've been looking at a lot right now is why are various people successful in a variety of endeavors? It doesn't have to be just business and or investing. And one thing I just keep coming back to is I study all these various interesting people and what they've done. Is one thing they all seem to really have in common is agility. They are agile thinkers and doers, and so they are almost the opposite of steady Eddie predictable. That there are certain aspects of their character that are steady Eddie predictable. I used to joke that I had a very low standard deviation return, but the more I study people especially as I open my aperture and study people really successful in the arts and really successful in politics, really successful in military strategy, etc. And one of the things that I keep seeing just time and again is agility, the ability to notice, oh, that's different.
Yeah.
I better not do it the old way. And again, he seems to have intuitively understood that one of the ways he could throw off to those other poker players was to use a randomized buzz before he announces what he's doing. What do you think? Because I would defer to you. You're better at studying this stuff than I am.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It's tricky because the market, or if you're in the business of investing, right, people would tell you oh, don't style drift, stick to what you know. But the reality is the world always changes, the market changes, and you have to adapt and evolve with that and have the mental agility. It's okay, this is actually this is where reasoning by analogy can really get you into trouble. Because you're oh, I've seen a banking crisis, so this next one's going to look like that one. And nope, financial crisis looked nothing like the 90s, the savings and loan crisis. So if you went by that playbook, you could really get yourself into hot water, and some very good investors did. So yeah, I think it's tricky because it's only obvious in retrospect whether it was agility or whether they just went off the reservation. But I do agree with you that it's important, and that it's rare. I think it's fairly easy to find someone who's really good for a cycle,
Yeah.
And it's very hard to find someone who's good for several cycles, because then things do change, the playbook changes, and you have to adapt. And the people who sustain performance through decades, I think that's just exceptionally rare, because that agility, also it's hard, right? Like at some point, technology moves on, and like we're used to certain things, which is why it's so unusual for someone like you to run a podcast and a venture firm and like be interested in all of that stuff. I think it's a lot more common for people to fall into these grooves and be like, no, this is what I like, and this is how I think the world operates, and now we're going to stick with that. And everything else is going to be cognitive dissonance, and I don't want to have anything to do with that. So the learning is rare, right? Because it takes effort. It's uncomfortable. It's like, I thought this worked this way, and now it no longer does. And this made me money all the time. Like, value investors are great examples for that, because they figured out these, spin-offs. So there were all of these special situations where like, this situation happens, this is going to make me money. And then other people discover it, the system gets gamed, the opportunity goes away, and you can keep chasing that thing, and it's not going to work anymore. And it's a lot harder to figure out the next one, right? So, agility is important and difficult, right? It's hard to let go of the old ideas. It's hard for me to let go of drafts that don't work in writing, like, and the investment is a lot lower. And I'm like, maybe this can be salvaged. And, a lot of times it's, we get so invested in our ideas and our values, and because it happened to us, like, it takes on more meaning or importance than maybe it should.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've always, one of the things that always worked for me that I always tried to do, usually not terribly successfully, but if I was like facing a certain conundrum or problem or whatever, I would play a game where I would create a character that was my best friend, and I would give that person advice. I would that would allow me some distance on the fact that this was really me. The classic asking for a friend.
It's really you, Jim. You're both of them. She lost you.
Well, go.
But that's not so easy either, right? Like stepping outside of yourself, because again, with the maze, but like, I think we're often aware of the things that are bugging. We just don't want to look there. Like, right. There might be things like, I know I could do this better. It's just for whatever reason, I'm in this loop of this habit and keep repeating this thing. It's like, people around me can see it. I can see it, but it's another part of me. And the part that's like operating day to day is like, I don't want to look at it because it has all of these other things connected to it, right? There's layers to that. So I think that's a really interesting exercise. I just worry that a lot of people, it takes some courage to do it honestly, right? Because there's a reason why.
Well, that's it takes courage.
Yeah, I'm already, I'm like, I got to do this exercise tonight.
It takes courage to put yourself out there in anything, right?
It does, yeah.
And that leaves us where we started, in the arena.
In the arena.
Or maybe in the maze.
In the maze, yes. Maybe there's arena deep inside the maze, but this was a lot of fun. Thanks, Jim.
I really enjoyed it. I loved your piece. Thank you for coming on at the last minute.